Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another session of Room for Discussion. Today we're going to discuss Shell and the energy transition. We all know Shell, the second largest oil company of the world, and its high dividends attract many investors, including our own pension funds from all over the world. Shell is, however, facing some sort of a dilemma. We've seen a Paris Agreement made in Paris last year. And what is Shell going to do with that agreement? And what will Shell as a company look like in 2050? What is its strategy? What is their scenario? We're going to talk about this and much more with two experts on Shell and the energy transition. First of all, none other than the manager energy transitions of Shell, Ewald Brunesse, who also holds a PhD in economics and has been a manager energy transitions for the past 11 years. Next to him is Thomas Moens, who has studied political science and philosophy, but is currently an investigative journalist on energy and climate for various papers and magazines. So in short, what role does Shell play in the energy transition, and what role does the energy transition play within Shell? If you have a question, please do go to the microphone. There will be specific moments for you to ask questions, or join the discussion on Twitter using #RFD. I'll be doing this interview due to rare circumstances on my own. But we're still with the three of us, and I think there's a lot to discuss. So please give the two gentlemen a warm hand. Gentlemen, welcome again.
Thank you.
To start off, Mr. Brunesse, there are so many things happening within and around Shell. The tender of the wind farm, the Follow This resolution, an oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And you're a manager energy transitions, but what do you actually do as a manager energy transitions?
Yeah, that's a nice question to start with, and I think that the main thing about the energy transition is that the system is going to change. It's going to change over time. It will take a number of decades, and we will move away, let's say, from the emission of carbon dioxide. And we will move towards what we call a low-carbon society. But at the same time, we will face a society that asks for more and more energy. So it's, let's say, twice the amount of energy without any carbon emissions. That should be the end goal. And from my personal perspective within Shell, I'm working on innovations to get innovations into the marketplace, and we can talk about this later. And all those innovations should be in the direction of lower emissions, both local emissions for local air quality and on the longer term, lower CO2 emissions.
All right. And one last question on this. I was wondering, your position is called Manager Energy Transitions, multiple transitions.
Yeah.
I thought there was only one transition from fossil to renewable.
Okay, well, that's a good question. And the S, the transitions, the multiple is explicitly, because there are many transitions going on at the same time. It is not a straight line between fossil fuels that we know today and renewables that we will have tomorrow, but there will be all kind of intermediate stations, things like energy storage, energy distribution, energy system integration, and they will all be part of that transition.
That bigger transition,
yeah.
So that there is one over-encompassing sort of transition.
Yeah, but it contains many, many elements. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Mr. Moens, you dove into the energy sector as a journalist.
Yeah.
You've spoken to both sides and written all about it, but what fascinates you most in this debate?
I think I mostly delved into the energy transition as a question for Holland, so it was limited in that sense. But I think what fascinates me and why I also wrote about Europe and try to look even outside of Europe in this question is sort of the nature of the problem of climate change. It's such a unique problem. It's an underlying systematic problem that, in a sense, caught everybody off guard. Not because we didn't know that climate change was happening, but that its actual sort of practical form, what it means to everybody involved, that's still some sort of an open question. It's still something we're sort of figuring out. And what's interesting is that if you talk about multiple transitions, and something I focused on and spoke on a number of occasions, is that if you look at the economic transitions in the energy field in Europe, we've seen huge transitions the past 20 years. And they've all moved towards liberalization, privatization, trying to put away as much policy questions into the market. And then at that point, climate change got real. So that fascinates me, that we have this huge problem that sort of underlies everything, and that governments have given away the means to make policy exactly at that point.
Right.
So that's
Right,
what I'm
yeah.
always interested in.
Mr. Bernesse, do you have the feeling that climate change is indeed underlying everything, as Mr. Moons describes?
Within the energy transition, there are always three questions people ask. First of all, it's about availability and accessibility. So, do I have enough energy to keep my standard of living? So that's question one. Question two is, can we afford it? How much do I have to pay for the energy bill? And the third question is about acceptability. And acceptability contains a lot of things that varies from safety and security up to even, let's say, do we like the view of the wind turbines or do we dislike them? And the overarching thing that deals with, let's say, the whole discussion, and that is really the most recent thing, is climate change. When we started the energy transition in the Netherlands around the year 2000, it was all about availability of energy. What would happen if we would, let's say, after the year 2025, have to import natural gas from other countries? What happens if the Groningen gas field would be used? So, but it changed over time. And now I think today, climate change is the focus.
Right. Let's talk a bit more about that availability part and climate change, and to get us some sort of common understanding, because there has been a lot of argument about climate change. First of all, does Shell recognize the Paris Agreement and support the objective to stay below 2 degrees Celsius?
We have, within Shell, we have a long-standing history in recognizing climate change. And if you look at the publications of Shell, we have always advocated a higher carbon price, because a high carbon price will give the best guarantee to, let's say, reduce emissions, to reduce carbon emissions, and to make a change.
So it does accept that 2 degrees is a dangerous limit?
We don't know about the 2 degrees, whether it's a dangerous limit, but we have accepted that the idea of all the scientists, they say, okay, the 2 degrees is dangerous, then we accept it as a fact.
All right. Then do you also accept that there is, with that 2 degrees as a sort of dangerous limit, that we cannot burn a certain, or we can only burn a maximum amount of fossil fuels? Some sort, people call it a carbon budget, a maximum amount of fossil fuels we can burn to stay below that 2 degrees limit.
Yeah, well, I disagree on that, because the question is not how much fossil fuels we can burn, but the question is how much carbon can we emit into the atmosphere, and that's the real question. It is not that there is a scarcity of fossil fuels or there's a scarcity of burning things, there's a scarcity of the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. And that's where the problem sits, and that's where you have to take the problem.
All right, so let's tackle the problem then in the next part, because as you sort of suggested, there are many more fossil fuels in the ground that we can possibly burn or eventually emit into the air. The IPCC states there are up to 3 times as more fossil fuel reserves already in the ground than we can burn to stay within that carbon budget, meaning 2 degrees Celsius. But how does that then relate to, so on the one hand, way many more fossil fuels in the ground. Other hand, 2 degrees Celsius, it doesn't match. How does that not contradict with what CEO Ben van Beurden was saying? I'll drill up as much as I can.
Well, you have to add something to that. He said, I will drill up natural gas. He didn't talk about coal, which is, of course, the most heaviest CO2 emitter in that respect. So replacing coal-fired power plants by, for instance, gas-fired power plants reduces the CO2 emissions by 50%. And you have also, well, here on the poster it says oil versus climate, but I think that you have to, you know that Shell is today over 50% a gas company. It's
okay,
more a gas company.
If you take gas, I mean, the report and the article in the journal Nature also stated at least 50% of all the gas reserves have to remain in the ground. So it doesn't really change the argument.
Okay, that's fair enough. And if you look at the global gas reserves, they're around 250 years. So if half should stay in the ground, then there's still a long way to use gas as the transition fuel for the coming decades.
So Shell is stating we can use gas for over 125 years and not cross that 2-degree limit.
If that's what allows to be emitted into the atmosphere, then the answer is yes, but you won't do it without carbon capture storage.
Right.
You simply will not emit all the carbon. We have to go, let's say, down rather than up in terms of emissions.
Right. Okay, so carbon capture storage is going to be really important. Mr. Moens, what was your first thought when you heard CEO Ben van Beurden say, I'll drill up as much as I can? Was that placed out of context?
I value honesty a lot. So as a journalist, I was very glad that he honestly took that standpoint. And I think it's fair. I think it's fair that that's, even if it relates to gas or oil, and I fully grant you the point that it was about gas, I think it's good that Shell is saying that, that we can have an honest conversation about that. What's problematic to my mind, and what I observe in my practice as an investigative journalist, is that the kicker, the nasty bit of that sentence is in as much as I can. And you see with big companies, and especially big energy companies, that they have a way of manipulating what they can. And I don't mean that badly or something, but the idea is that who limits Ben van Beurden, or who limits Shell or Exxon, or in what they can? Well, the argument usually is governments. European Union, Dutch government, United States government, some sort of sovereign government says, okay, you cannot drill any more. We're setting the cap. It's these governments that set the emission caps. Now, and that's where it gets complicated, and that's where it gets interesting for me as an investigative journalist, because then the lobbying starts taking place. Because who is the government going to call to establish what Shell can do? We see in the Netherlands that the Dutch government calls Shell to arrange and to come up with what they should do.
Right, Mr. Banesse, do you think that Shell by itself can be sort of stopped drilling for gas, oil, or any other fossil fuel?
Well, at this moment in time, there is a real cap. And so the cap is minus 40% carbon emissions by the EU in 2030. So that's a real cap. The other cap, which is not that hard at this moment, is the 2050 cap, 80 to 95% carbon reductions. So those are simply hard caps. And they are there already. And then
for a company as well, or just for a country?
For the countries, for the whole.
Right.
But okay, that determines on what can be used in the country by you and me and all the other consumers, of course. And if that cap is there, then it is up to the companies like Shell to find solutions how to provide a country with energy without, let's say, touching that cap, to stay below that cap.
But just to be sure, because I still don't really see how it actually works now, because there is this carbon budget, we've agreed upon that, to stay below 2 degrees. And there are all these fossil fuels, but up to what extent can Shell go on drilling for these fossil fuels with this carbon budget in mind?
If you mean by the carbon budget, let's say the 40% reduction, carbon reduction set by the EU, then that simply limits. And there is
let's say we use the 1,000 gigatons of CO2, which is sort of a carbon budget up to 2050. And the IPCC states there's up to 3,000 gigatons of proven reserves in the ground. So how does Shell relate to that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we underwrote that statement.
Right.
So that's one thing that we agree on that. But on the other hand, we have to recognize that it is still not, let's say, cast in stone. That is not a hard target for the world. That's still an IPCC target. And now, as I agree with you, there's no government or no global government that said, well, that's the hard stop.
But the world agreed that we would stay below 2 degrees, right? So that is a hard target, isn't it?
It is a political target, and it's a kind of an ideal, but now we have to translate it back into, let's say, national targets and what can happen.
Right. So, Mr. Moons, Shell recognizes the problem of climate change and that 2 degree as a limit. Have you seen Shell change over time in its behavior or its strategy towards this scenario?
Well, I've been doing research since 2012, and that's 4 years roughly. Big oil companies don't change that fast. But no, of course, you see very clearly that it's as you said, it's part of the agenda. But what that's going to mean practically, we don't know yet. We see that a shift that Shell was already making towards gas is taking place, and that coincides nicely with the fact that gas emits less carbon dioxide than coal. And that's true, but that wasn't specifically climate-driven, that transition. And gas is going to be a problem.
Because what was the main priority, or what is Shell's main priority in that sense?
Staying competitive, as far as I know. I think oil reserves have been shown to be not the best, the next hottest thing. I mean, the most interesting markets right now is natural gas in Asia or Oceania, so Australia and Eastern Asia.
Mr. Bonesse, what actually is Shell's main priority?
The main priority is, of course, as an organization, to grow and to prosper. So, and it can be in any direction. If you have seen, let's say 125 years ago, Shell was started as a full petroleum company, as an oil company. Now it's more than 50% natural gas. And of course, we will transform over time, and that's a natural process. So if you have old companies, some companies really stick to their own thing, like Dow Egberts coffee, and they still have coffee. Shell is still energy, but there is the big transition from oil to natural gas, and what's lying behind, of course.
Right. Then coming back to that earlier statement, that half, what I said before, half of the proven oil, or the gas reserve, to be specific, cannot be burned if we'd like to stay below 2 degrees. Many people were asking also at the annual general meeting of Shell, why are you looking for even more oil and gas if we already have too many proven reserves? What is Shell's sort of response to those people?
Yeah. Well, if you take a normal reserve that you have, it's about 10 years outlook. Normally, oil companies have something like 10 years in reserves. But of course, you have to look behind the 10 years. What is happening, well, let's say after the year 2026? Do we then stop with oil and gas from one day to the other? I think the answer is no. There will be a gradual change, but you have to look beyond the normal period of the 10 years that you have as a...
But so, then I would think there will be a gradual decline. Is that right? Because we'd like to become less addicted to fossil fuels.
I think that if you say it in one phrase, then Coal is more or less on the way out in the coming decade. Oil, in certain areas of the world, it's a kind of a standstill or even in a decline already, like Northwestern Europe. And natural gas will take a longer view on that. Yeah.
And
So that shift is clearly visible.
right, but that in some of your scenarios, oil and gas are actually remaining stable up to 2060 or 2070. In the oceans and mountains scenario, for example, oil and gas are still, on a global outlook, remain stable. So how do you sort of explain that then?
Going to the scenarios of Shell, if you take the mountain scenario, oil is on the way out because of electrification of traffic. So that's a clear decline for oil. In the ocean scenario, which is a scenario without strong governments, there is a competition between, on the one hand, the traditional car manufacturers, on the other hand, the electricity. But electricity is not the winning system in oceans, simply because there are no subsidies to finance the Teslas and those kind of things. And then there's the third scenario that we've published recently, which is called A Better Life and a Healthy Planet. Yeah, you've the booklet, that's great. And that is really a normative scenario in which we focus on a net zero emission. And in the net zero emission, for instance, in a region like Europe, by the end of the century, most of the energy system will be electrified.
Right. Thomas Moens, I don't know whether you've read these scenarios, but to what extent do you think it's possible to keep on using fossil fuels, oil and gas, up to 2050, 2060, and still remain in that 2-degree scenario?
No, I think that's very problematic. I think that, as you already said, that depends on carbon capture storage, all sorts of ways to keep burning stuff without emitting stuff.
Right, and carbon capture storage,
Yeah,
explain?
that's a tragic history of carbon capture storage. The idea is that it mostly works with power plants. So you have a power plant that has a chimney, and you put another chimney on the chimney, and that sucks the CO2 out of the emitting gases and stores it underground, preferably in empty gas fields, for instance. Well, here you get the same problem that we see everywhere with climate change and with emission problems, is that it's of course not a business case. Nobody makes stuff out of putting away stuff. You know, you don't make money by putting away CO2 in the ground. And what we're seeing, I actually visited a coal plant, a modern Dutch coal plant, huge coal plant. It's going to emit a very lot. And they were building it, and I was in the chimney, and there was a hole, and it had the size of a car. You could drive a Mini through it. And I asked the engineer, what's that? He says, yeah, we had to make our power plant capture ready. I said, what does that mean? I said, well, that if someday someone finds the business case to tap out the CO2, then we're ready.
Right, so
and we're ready. And I asked, is someone ever going to do that? And he shrugged. So it's not on tape, but he...
Right, so this technology is not in place yet, as I understand, right, Mr. Renes?
No, but we have to radically rethink the way we are paying for this stuff. This is the problem. If you do not want a government that either forces or companies or pays for itself for doing that, and leaves it to the innovation in the market or those sort of half-empty slogans, then it's not going to work.
Right.
So it's of course carbon capture storage. It didn't work in the past, and we need some radical shifts if we want to let it work in the future.
So that is going to be
radical
crucial.
shifts that are not in place yet.
Right, so it's not in place, but it is going to be crucial if we want to go, reading Shell reports, if we want to go to a net zero emissions world, carbon capture storage is going to be hugely important.
Yeah, that's true. And the way you look at carbon capture storage with the example of the carbon capture ready, I know these examples and they're not the best examples.
Are there better real ones?
I think that carbon capture storage in the longer term is about pre-combustion rather than post-combustion. So what we do today is we first burn the natural gas or the coal in your example, and then take out the carbon from the chimney and then store it underground. Okay, that's the solution for the couple of coming decades to come. But on the longer term, you would like to leave the carbon where you found it. For instance, if you produce natural gas at some point on the world, you simply strip out the carbon, you take the hydrogen as a very clean fuel, bring that to the market and keep the carbon where it was.
Right, but the whole problem is
then,
that these technologies don't exist yet.
They do exist, and they will come off the ground, and that will take time, of course.
Right.
And if there is, what I said before, if there is a real carbon price, which makes it possible to bridge that gap, and that's a price that, of course, the users, the end users, is going to pay in the products or wherever, or the government is going to collect it.
But having these developments in mind with carbon technology, with all the gas we still have in reserve and are likely to need the coming decades, does Shell predict, or does Shell really accept this as some sort of holy grail, if you like, or does it also predict we're probably going to surpass this 2-degree limit because the world just needs energy?
Well, I think that's a fair question. And if you read the booklet, I think you can see the dilemma. It's a very normative scenario. So it's a scenario that really puts a dot on the horizon and tells us about how to get to net zero emissions. And it is also written that it is an enormous challenge. We don't get it for free, so to speak. So we have to put a lot of things in place, and I totally agree with you that governments play a key role in that in order to create level playing fields, in order to steer it in the right direction. And
right. Let's talk a bit more on people who have gotten less, sort of say, trust in companies and in the government. But before we do that, we have a question from the audience.
Yes, before I go to the audience, I have one from Twitter, from Donald. And let me just open it. He says, he asks, maybe for both of you, is there a risk of large oil and gas companies of being too big to adapt to the changing system? Mr. Mintz, maybe for you.
Being too big to what?
To adapt to the changing system.
Yes, I think of course that's a real risk. Yeah, but I mean, you already said that companies have choices. There are still companies that only make film rolls while we're all on digital. They used to be really big and now they're really small. I mean, don't look at an economy as something with fixed players. You have creative destruction. Yeah, but that.
Any addition? Or then we'll go to what I'd like to talk about briefly is the divestment movement. I call it a movement because there are various players and actors and citizens around the world, even newspapers, The Guardian, who are calling on institutional investors to remove their money, to remove their investments from fossil fuel companies. Mr. Moons, first of all, why do these actors call for divestment in the first place?
Well, I think because they see, because they've really listened to companies, because they really listen to fossil fuel companies, and what fossil fuel companies are saying is, yeah, I'd like to, but my shareholders. So they've taken the next step, and they're saying, well, let's target the shareholders. And I think that's great, actually. I find it very inspiring and interesting. And what I find very inspiring in that is that that it targets not only the rational, the classically economical rational investor, because let's get real. There are no strong governments. There are no governments that will start to cut in their own start to spend more because they want to be the one guiding country that's going to get green. All governments are also going to act in their interest. So we're going to surpass the 2-degree limit. I think that's beyond doubt. But what
You
he's-
are certain
but
that we are
I'm
going to
quite
surpass
pessimistic
the 2
about
degree?
that, yeah.
Right.
I mean, everything remaining equal. I mean, we're now seeing that Antarctica isn't melting and that sort of stuff.
Right.
But what this campaign is doing is something that's a fascinating phenomenon from rational choice theory, is that I don't act in my interests, but I anticipate my interests depending on your behavior. So maybe all the shareholders of fossil fuel companies will for themselves decide, no, it's rational to keep my money in them. But if you are irrational, if you're the one that are irrational and you're going to pull your money, then you might start pulling your money, and then you might, and then I might be the smartest one to start pulling out my money first. So what they're trying to create, this divestment campaign, and what I find very interesting, is sort of an irrational stampede of investors and shareholders.
Right.
And I mean, as a journalist, I would love to see that happening.
It is already in some form happening, of course, because this is a different type of maybe activism. There are green activists, Greenpeace, but these are serious investors, and including Mark Campanale, the founder of Carbon Tracker Initiative. They claim that there is a carbon bubble, an amount of fossil fuels converted into assets which are basically unburnable because of the 2 degree limit. And he states there are at least for $1.4 trillion of assets in the world in danger because of unburnable carbon due to that 2 degree scenario. What is Shell's response to this massive amount of capital that is in danger, according to him?
I think you have to ask yourself the question, where does that kind of capital sit? And let me give you the Shell example. As an energy company, when we trade 100 units of energy in the marketplace, and it can be petrol or diesel or natural gas, then about 50 of those units are from our own factories, our own plants, and about the 50 that come from the own plants, about 25 is from own sources. So in fact, we are more a trading company than a producing company. So that means that we are, relatively speaking, asset light. So I'm always looking, where do the assets then sit? Is it the refinery? Is it the oil well or the gas source?
But they state, okay, Shell is Shell, and the whole company is in danger. It's $1.4 trillion in all those fossil fuel companies all around the world. There is this carbon bubble. It's just dangerous to invest in these companies because they cannot burn all their reserves.
No, but there are many, many companies that you even cannot invest in. Most of those companies you're referring to are simply state-owned.
Right.
Huh?
But
the Shells
but
and the
of
Exxons
course.
is just a small proportion where the investments...
Of course, but we're still talking probably about billions of dollars, including Shell. But Shell is not afraid of any of these divestment movements or...
We listen and we see what is happening. As a member of the Dutch Shell pension fund, I'm a board member, we see the discussions around what we call ESG, environmental, social and governance. And we know that there are many, many issues attached to that. We know the discussions, and of course we have any conversation that anybody likes.
Right. Mr. Moons, do you think Mr. Brunesse should be worried about these divestment campaigners, about these investors, about Carbon Tracker Initiative?
No, because the moment he gets worried, it'll show, and the investors will run. So what Shell needs to do is remain calm. No, I mean, yeah, I think you could be worried about that, and I think Shell is worried in a sense because they are taking this seriously.
How are they taking this seriously?
They're answering.
Right.
He's explaining to you why you're wrong. Well, that's step one. Your divestment campaign is being taken seriously, unlike many other campaigns.
Right. We'll go to a quick question of the audience again.
Who has a question?
Oh, who has a
Maybe
question?
about this. I see a divestor here.
An investor, I think, actually.
Yeah, okay. You just keep the microphone, because then I won't talk too long. Gentlemen. Mark van Baal, follow this. We try to organize investors to encourage Shell to take more leadership in the energy transition. And the question I have for you as a manager and manager in innovations, what is the perspective you tell your colleagues that Shell has in a fossil-free world? What kind of business models do you think Shell will use in, let's say, 20, 30 years from now? At the moment, the energy transition is done. So I don't want to hear anything about oil or gas, but how is Shell going to make money? What are your business models? What is your perspective for the after the fossil era?
Thank you for your question.
That's a bit of a, let's say, it's a question that makes a lot of assumptions, Mark. But coming back to the structure of Shell, of course, we are more of a trading company rather than a producing company.
But trading fossil fuels, right?
But also electricity. In the US, we are the second largest electricity trader, and it comes from all kinds of sources, including wind, sun, etc. So I can think of a future where trading will become more and more important for a company like Shell. And of course, the basic of every company, and economists like you here know, that's the first lesson, companies connect supply and demand, and there is a price that sits in between.
Right, and so supply and demand. But coming back to that question which was raised,
Maybe you want to come back to that?
Well,
yeah, I think you're doing it already. But what I'm looking for is concrete business models. Say, we're going to make money by building wind farms in sea. We're going to make money by storing electricity in large caverns, or all kind of ways to. So these kind of projects, I'm hoping for that, because I'm fully aware that Shell needs perspective. Your leadership should tell your 90,000 people, this is where we're going.
Yeah. Well, a lot of those projects are still undefined, of course. They're still in early stages of the pipeline. But when talking about trading, distribution, including storage, that can be the main components of an electricity or an energy company of the future. And for instance, one of the things I'm also looking at is the role of the locally produced energies from, let's say, energy cooperatives, like here in Amsterdam. Wij krijgen kippen, as we know each other from there. What can that mean on the longer term, when everybody produces its own energy for the houses and for the local traffic and so on?
Right, but so far there are no concretely defined business models for after a fossil era, whether that be 2050, 2060, 2070.
I think those business models still have to develop. Let me give you an example. If you build a wind turbine, or if you put a solar panel on the rooftop, after you have installed that equipment, the energy is for free. And that's something that you have to factor in. That's something that you have to think about in your new business models. If people install solar panels on the rooftop and they don't have to pay for the electricity price thereafter, how does that work in markets then? And that's something that's still, the jury is still out. It's an open question how that will work out.
Right, an open question. We'll briefly go to the long-term strategy and scenario then. This was actually a good opening question. Ben van Beurden, your CEO, stated in the sustainability report of 2015, it is likely that over the next few decades, through the global energy transition, Shell will emerge as a different company. So we don't know yet what climate scenario Shell is actually taking on, whether that's 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 1.5 degrees, or even more. But Mr. Moens, to start off with you, 2 months ago, Maurits Groen sat at where you were sitting now. He is the #1 sustainable entrepreneur. And he said, Shell will not exist in 25 years' time. Would you agree with him?
I find it very good investigative journalistic policy not to make any predictions about the future. No, I really do not know. I think there are what what slightly annoys me, and I think I share that with a number of Shell employees about this discussion about the energy transition, is the number of assumptions behind it. We just don't know. The jury is out on a lot of technologies. The jury is out on what a lot of government's going to do. And keep in mind that the 2-degree scenario is dangerous because our models do not predict effectively what is behind the 2 or upwards from 2 degrees. What I do
know
see,
that 2 degrees already is a dangerous limit. That has been agreed
yeah,
upon.
but after that we don't know.
But we want to stay below.
And we
it,
probably
right?
don't know how we're going to burn, but there's a lot of uncertainty. What I do see, if I look around, is that climate adaptation is becoming big business. I mean, government policy and industry is really steering industry, especially in the Netherlands, towards making big bucks from building dams and dikes. So the world is going to change, and I think Shell is a very smart company. And if you look at the early history of oil companies and also of Shell, there's a wonderful book, The Prize by Daniel Jurgen, and it's good reading, although it's a very heavy book, so you need somehow to position it on your knee. But the wonderful history in that book is that he traces all those early oil companies, and what he really shows is how they make sort of split-second historical decisions that sort of put them on a path towards where they're now, and it's completely contingent.
Right.
We don't know, and I think as an investigative journalist, which is sort of the most pessimistic genre of journalism, I'm not going to make all those assumptions about companies.
All right, no future
being
predictions from your side.
No.
Mr. Burness, I'm still going to try. I assume that you think Shell will exist in 2050. What will Shell look like in 2050?
Nobody really knows, of course. We have to be there in 2050 before we really know. I agree with you that companies, not only oil companies, but most companies, have been quite adaptive. And of course, we all have the example of Kodak, and we have a couple of other examples, but most companies are quite adaptive. And for a company like Shell, and it also goes for some other big energy companies, they are also part of the system, part of the energy system. And so they cannot step in, step out, and do something very different just 1 year from now, or something like that. And that takes out a lot of volatility out of the system. That has also an upside. When you have a couple of big companies that really carry the system, then you have a large number of smaller companies that can do all kind of different plays, a new place.
Let's talk a bit about one part you've actually stepped into, namely renewables.
Yeah.
There's a consortium on a tender of a wind farm in the south of the Netherlands. But just in short, how serious is Shell about renewables?
Yeah. Well, let's take the wind example first. The first wind farm out on the North Sea, off the coast of Bergen, that's 50% Shell, 50% Nuon. And it is now in operation since the year 2007, so that's almost 10 years. And what we have seen over the last 10 years, that the Dutch government was not very serious with putting new wind farms out on the North Sea. And we have 3 now operational. This one, the ones that are going to be realized in the coming years under the so-called National Energy Agreement, that's the big stuff. Borssele 1, Borssele 2, and then a whole range of things.
But that's the Dutch government.
Yeah.
I was wondering to what extent Shell is serious about it.
Could I make an argument that you cannot make? But I've, with the team, and especially Jelmer Mommers, investigated the National Climate Agreement, and or the National Energy Agreement, and we must say, Shell was greener than the Dutch government was in its position. Shell took a number of steps to limit the use of coal and biomass in the Dutch energy mix in those agreements. It tells you something about the influence of Shell, that it worked, but at that moment, Shell was actually pushing greener than the Dutch
and
national
probably
government.
because coal is not in Shell's best interest, but gas
Well,
is. But let me just state that In this booklet, sort of your optimus scenario, you also state we need research and development to accelerate innovation in low carbon materials, processes, and technologies. So major important issue, investment in renewables. But still, you only invest 1% of your research investment portfolio in renewables, and all the rest goes into fossil fuels. Why is it only such a small fraction?
Now, it is not the research. In research, we invest more in renewable energies.
So how much is that approximately?
I think it was $1 billion over the last 5 years. And then, of course, it depends on how you define renewables. We do not build wind turbines, that's Vestas. And we invest in wind turbines. But if you talk about the investigations in renewables, it is mainly about biofuels. It is about hydrogen and the production and distribution of hydrogen. So I think that we have to make a clear distinction between, on the one hand, developing and investing in big projects like wind on the North Sea. That's an investment. And the research and development, as we do, for instance, here on the IJ in Amsterdam North, that is more in other directions.
Right.
We don't research wind.
Right. But do you still agree that when you state yourselves, we need so much more R&D in renewable technologies, why wouldn't that be something for Shell to do?
Yeah. Well, we have a department which is called Future Energy Technologies that sits here in Amsterdam, and there we look at all the alternative energies that we can use, where we can find a future position. For instance, energy storage is one of the things. If there's no sun and no wind, we still want to have energy. Will that be supplied by batteries, or will there be different technologies? So it is not only the wind turbine or the solar panel, it is the whole system that you have to look at, including things like storage.
Would you say that Shell is ambitious in developing and in investing in renewable energy?
I think we are very ambitious, but perhaps not in the way that most people see it.
Right.
Huh?
We just
So
don't, the public just doesn't see it.
There are different opinions, there are different ideas about renewable energy. For most people, it's the solar panel on the rooftop. That's renewables, or the wind turbine in the polders. For Shell, it is more about the system. If you take, for instance, where the energy goes to in the whole system, then it is about a quarter, 25% goes to the houses. But a bigger chunk goes to the big industries. And that is where I think our biggest challenge lies in how are we going to deal with all the materials that we use every day, all the plastics, all the things that are... And that's another part of the energy transition which is less visible to people, but it is still there. If you take your own energy bill, then about 30% of all the energy that you use, you pay directly. You pay to the gas company, you pay to the petrol station, you pay the electricity. But 70% of the energy that you use, you don't see. You don't pay electricity when you take a trip with the Dutch railways. It's included in the ticket. You don't pay for the jet fuel if you take a plane. You don't pay for all the energy which is accumulated in all the food that you buy from the supermarket. So and those are typically the things that are a bit behind the scene, but where companies like Shell are working on technologies to make our products in that respect also much carbon lighter.
Mr. Moons, do you agree that there is enough sort of ambition and that this phase is going to be fast enough, including in Shell, to go towards this new low carbon?
There is enough ambition in Shell?
If there is enough ambition in Shell to...
I find that hard to say. I want to go back to your point about the perception problem, and I think it's good to focus on Shell's role, and I like to do that, and the role of other gas companies. But you have to understand that they're in this weird position, politically speaking, where everybody is using their stuff, and everybody is mad at them. you have to understand that if you ask, is there more ambition in Shell? Yeah, how would they sort of find that we would be willing to pay for probably more expensive products because we somehow pay for the pollution? Where would a company find that out in the market that we have at the moment?
So would you argue it's not really up to Shell, it's up to the government or consumers, or?
It's up to a government. It's up to a government as a democratic representative. But this is, if you look at that in practice, that's very hard to determine. What I find very interesting is that if you look at the national government's strategy on gas in the Netherlands, of course, you know, we're the Kuwait of Northwestern Europe. You know, we have a lot of gas and we have enormous contracts down into Italy. We make a lot of cash with that. The government makes a lot of cash with that, thanks to Shell and Exxon helping us in Groninger field. If you look at the investments that were made with public money in this gas strategy, it's up to 8 billion euros. Over the past years. And if you look at the way those decisions were made, no gas accords, no gas dialogues. Most stuff didn't even go through parliament. And if you contrast that with the way we're talking about renewables, somehow we want big popular movements behind renewables. We want democratic decisions about our energy system when we're going to make it green. And there's a real weird, and that fascinates me, and maybe it fascinates me more as a political philosopher than an investigative journalist, but what's really weird with that is that somehow green energy, renewable energy is a democratic subject. We need to talk about it with one another. And if we look at gas, $8 billion in public investments in gas, and we already lost sort of 2 to 3 billion, just went up in the air, nobody talked about it. It wasn't discussed in parliament, it wasn't discussed in major newspapers. So there's a weird disparagement. And Shell is usually the party that arranges stuff outside of parliament with the national government. Used to do that, and it worked really well for everybody. That they did it like that. So we are also dealing with two different political cultures.
Right.
And I have to make a comparison. I have a good friend of mine. She's now doing a PhD in political philosophy in London, and she always said, "Look, being a vegetarian is a moral choice. Not being a vegetarian is no choice at all." And so that's what we're seeing in this discussion about renewables, is that somehow switching to renewables, switching to green is something we need to discuss, is something that the government wants to discuss extensively. We've had a climate agreement, and then we asked the minister, okay, what are you going to do with the climate agreement? And he said, well, we're going to have to do an energy dialogue. So somehow renewables is a moral choice, and fossil fuel isn't. And what I would like to see, and what I think even Shell would benefit from that in the long run, is if we sort of corrected the balance and made really clear where our choices were. And that will be quite a horrific image. If exactly what you're saying, the amount of energy being put in industry that you don't see, that you do not really pay for, is staggering.
Right.
Is really staggering.
We do have to move on to another audience question.
Thanks. So in the 80s and 90s, when you joined Shell and were the head of marketing for Shell Global, I think, but correct me if I'm wrong, Shell was able to act with really relative impunity as part of a wider coalition funding efforts to like derail climate agreements, and it's well documented. And it's out there, yeah. And yet now this year, Shell is, according to PR Weekly, the world's most hated company. So to follow that trajectory down the road, do you see a time when you'll become publicly vilified? And does that keep you up at night? And do you notice that the majority of people here have bullshit bingo in their hands and are clapping and saying bingo most times that you speak?
The bullshit bingo. Well, I know that it's a very popular management game, so we have often...
You play it as well.
They pioneered it.
Yeah, I know it. And so it's a kind of every management wave brings its bullshit bingo with it. I think that Shell is a company that in general stands quite close to its customers. We do have a lot of customers, business, but also, of course, business consumer, private customers that fill up at the petrol stations. And I think that we are in the position to listen to the customers and to do what the customers ask. And at the same time, we also have to tell our customers that we do things that go beyond that, and sometimes they fail. And let me give you a couple of examples. When I was running the electricity business of Shell, the green electricity business of Shell, our customers only wanted to take the electricity if it was the same price as the so-called grey electricity. It should not be more expensive, and preferably it should be cheaper. The same example I had with the Pura when I was running the marketing for Shell, the Pura gasoline, which was a more environmentally friendly gasoline, and all the market research showed that about 30% of the customers would use that product. When we introduced it in the marketplace, it was only 5%.
Right, so basically...
There is and then of course you have to bridge that gap of the price, that it's a little bit more expensive. And people say, yes, of course I'm going to do that for the environment. But at the end, well, people don't always walk that talk.
Right, okay. Thank you for your question.
Maybe another question in the
There's room
audience?
for, let's say, two more.
Hello, my name is Wilma Ehrenstein. I would like to talk to you about what I call the electrification of society. Because what we see now is that new houses are well insulated, they have heat pumps or infrared panels, so they're not even connected to the gas anymore. We see the same in the vehicles, that the electric cars are growing. The infrastructure for fast charging of electric cars is appearing along the highways. So my question to you is, how fast do you actually think this is going? And this, I think, has a huge impact on Shell. So how are you going to deal with that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think your observation is quite right. That will go rapidly, electrification of society. And of course, dream of most people is to put solar panels on the rooftop, have a heat pump installed that provides all the heat, and have a charge pole that fills their car with electricity. So that's the ideal situation. There is, however, one thing that keeps us from that ideal, and that's the seasons of the year. During the summertime, like today, we have enough energy to make this happen at the level of the houses. However, in the winter times, let's say starting in November up to February, we have not enough. So there will be a kind of a technology needed in order to bring electricity and energy from today to cold winter months, and that will be one of the biggest challenges.
Do you agree that by, if I'm saying indeed in this booklet it also stated, now around 20% of our energy consumption is electricity, and that will go to up to 50%. Yeah. But how is Shell dealing with that? Because we don't see any sort of electrification incentives or anticipation in Shell.
Yeah, I think that electricity, that is something that we now get from the wall socket by putting the plug, but there are many, many other ways of thinking in terms of electricity. For instance, one of the big projects in Shell is what we call hydrogen. And hydrogen, that's of course part of natural gas, or you can produce hydrogen from electricity by splitting water into oxygen and hydrogen. And hydrogen can be used as a kind of a storage medium. So you can shift electricity from the summer months to the winter months by storing it in molecules rather than in batteries. So there are more roadways in that respect. And I think that Shell is looking, as I told before, in terms of what is happening on storing, distribution, and trading of energy. And electricity is not just the 230 volts that we get from the wall.
Last question, 2 questions. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Stef Hartman, student international relations. Related to what you said, Shell is part of the energy system, and we're looking for hydrogen. Is hydrogen the only option that Shell can maintain its position in a centralized energy system? because I think electrification will decentralize the system, and Shell is probably not part of that.
Okay, well, part of the part of the electricity system will be decentralized. There will be also a part which will be heavily centralized. Take, for instance, the huge power plants that will be built out on the North Sea. That's what I would call centralized, because you can compare that with a nuclear power plant or a big gas-fired power plant. So there will be both centralization and decentralization. And for the decentralization, there will be a kind of what I would call aggregation. So take, for instance, the individual household, take the local cooperatives, and the local cooperatives, if they have an oversupply of electricity, they want, of course, they want to sell it to make up for their investments. So there will be parties, let's say a kind of an Airbnb or a kind of an Uber, that will play a role in aggregating, let's say, the rooms that you have available, or the cars that you have available, or the energy that you have available.
Right.
Yeah.
Two last questions.
Okay,
Yeah.
2 last questions.
Since the future of the energy companies or oil companies such as Shell is quite unsure, some economists believe that it forces companies to produce more oil in the short term. Do you think that is happening, or that it's possible that this would happen?
Okay, well, let me rephrase the question a little bit, because who is actually producing the oil? And in most of the cases, it is not the company. The company is, of course, the executor, but the one who gives the order to produce more oil is most of the times a local government, somewhere in one of the oil-producing companies, and of course, countries. And of course, they have the dilemma at this moment in time that they need to keep their income streams as a country. But with the low oil prices, that may push them into producing even more oil. And so it's a dilemma, but I don't think it's the oil company that wants to pump up more oil because they cannot use it later, or because the price is low.
Mr. Muns, I saw you questioning.
Now, what you always, I mean, looking at Holland, which sort of counts as a functional state, more or less, kind of. You see that okay, governments take decisions about how much to pump up, for instance, from Groningen or wherever. But what you also see, and I don't know if this holds exactly true in this specific chain of decision making, but what you also see is that these governments do not possess or want to possess the exact knowledge to make these decisions. So you have this weird sort of mirror thingy going on, where the oil company is being ordered to do stuff, but they're also the advisor on energy questions for the government, and the government wants that. I mean, it's not that they're being stalked. Now they're being asked, come in, tell us about.
Tell us what to do.
Tell us what to do. Tell us what do you think. You are the experts. I'm just a civil servant trying to keep my minister from falling.
Would that stop us from moving faster towards?
Yeah, of course that stops us from moving faster, because you cannot blame Shell for advising in its current vested interests. But you can blame a government for asking Shell all the time. Or, for that instance, asking, which is far worse for climate than Shell at the moment, the big energy users in the Netherlands who just want coal-fired cheap energy. The first thing I learned when I was an investigative journalist is there is no separation between market and state at this level. There is, for me as a freelancer, I mean, if the big state and that sort of, I can't lobby the state. But when you become a very big company, you are invited at the table, because otherwise you cannot make policy. I mean, it's completely rational to do so, but it is happening. So don't think that there is a strict separation between state and market.
All right, lessons learned. Last question.
Thanks. Yeah, I just want to address the public. We are in an academic environment now. I suppose there are a lot of brilliant students looking for a master thesis, and my conclusion today is that Shell lacks the perspective. They lack business models, and so I would advise everybody looking for a master thesis, go to Shell and say, I'm going to think of new business models for you, because you are young, your mind is much more creative, and you have much more imagination than middle-aged men like me and Ewald. So please think of these new business models, because we need them. We need you to think of them.
I like your comment, Mark. And to start with that, one of my old colleagues, perhaps you know it, Desiree Brakenhoff, is now writing a master thesis about the phenomenon local energy cooperatives, and she will graduate 2 weeks from now on that. And she has also looked into business models for the local energy cooperatives. And I invite everybody to come up with good solutions. There's a beautiful book about how to create business models. So I can, advise that everybody to read it, and good ideas are always very welcome.
Right,
Thank you for your comment, Mark.
Thank you for that comment. So Mr. Moons, just once more, with all the shells, with all the governments, with all these consumers, will we be able to stay below 2 degrees if we put everything
Everything being equal? So no...
Well, business as usual, no, of course.
Yeah.
But things, but if we change, if there...
if we change, we can change. But how are we going to change? How is that being done? I honestly... but I'm not entirely pessimistic, because what I said about the divestment campaign also holds true about the quote-unquote success of the Paris agreements, in the sense that you might not need real policy on climate action. You might just need an anticipation of a number of countries, followed by the participation of other people and other companies. So no, I'm not completely hopeless, but what I do argue against, because it sort of teeters into all the other totalitarian notions of history that we've had over the past centuries, is that energy transitions are inevitable.
Right. Mr. Brenesse, clearly we are currently addicted to fossil fuels. Now my question to you is Shell going to help society to rehab, or is it going to remain our dealer?
Well, I don't feel addicted to what you call fossil fuels. However, we have an addiction towards energy usage. We cannot simply do without energy and keeping the lifestyle as we have to. So in that way, we are addicted. One of the things that I've seen when I installed the solar panels on my rooftop 15 years ago, I was the only one, and people were thinking, hey, that oil man, why is he doing that? Are we running out of oil or something like that? Today, it is more or less the other way around. If I look still in the same neighborhood where I live, more and more people are doing this. And now the social norm becomes, why don't you have them?
Does every Shell employee
am I crazy that I don't have them on the rooftop?
Does every Shell employee have solar panels?
I haven't counted them, but I dare say that I will put a bet on that it will be higher than the national average.
Right.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank you both. Next week, Tuesday, we have another session on Brexit with Matthijs Schiffers. He is a journalist from the FD. And Paul Scheffer, author and EU expert. Please join us next Tuesday and give the two gentlemen a warm hand. Thank you.